In a week that's been dominated by free trade agreements, a couple of things need to be said. We see the polls and Tony Abbott apparently in all sorts of trouble. Well, a little over a year ago, Tony Abbott said he wanted to seal free trade agreements with China, Japan and South Korea within a year. And the quote-unquote experts said it couldn't happen. The experts laughed at Tony Abbott, said it was simple-minded. In the words of one writer, well, even Peter Harcher in the Sydney Morning Herald has said today, it's Tony Abbott who can laugh. His government has struck trade liberalisation deals with Australia's first, second and third biggest export markets. Now, you know my reservations about some of these details, and those are going to have to be addressed, but the one issue that hasn't been acknowledged was highlighted by Professor Kerry Brown, the director of the China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, when he wrote yesterday, quote, while avoiding cheap cynicism, we should ask ourselves, to what do we owe this largesse and surfeit of warm words from the Chinese leader? He said, Chinese leaders live in a world where every word and gesture is calculated, every nuance and shade of meaning carefully considered. It would be folly to ignore this, even if we might like to think that the Chinese leader's ardour for Australia during his visit was something that rose spontaneously from his heart. Chinese politicians do everything for a reason, especially abroad. That's Professor Kerry Brown, the director of the China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. Chinese politicians do everything for a reason. And, of course, as I've said, one of the things they're doing is to secure autonomous agricultural provinces of China in Australia. They've achieved that without a shot being fired. They were buying up our dairy farms, buying up agricultural land, and as one writer said to me, at least our country has not been destroyed and overrun by violent means to achieve this servitude status of major supplier of food to satisfy China's growing needs. And of course we've got nothing to show for it. They own the farm, they own the food. Nothing in it for us. However, on the wider issue, Tony Abbott has achieved what his knockers said he couldn't achieve. Even though the story that dominated APEC and carried over into the G20 was the so-called deal between Barack Obama and China over so-called global warming. John Lee, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., called the so-called deal that the left and the ABC and everyone fell over in order to attack Abbott, quote, the false idealism of Barack Obama's climate change grand compact with China. Wrote John Lee from the Hudson Institute of Washington, quote, having ambushed a hostile Congress with the deal, the US President knows that American caps on carbon emissions are unlikely to ever be passed into law. The vague promise by China that its emissions will peak by 2030 was something that Beijing's own modelling suggested would occur as a result of business as usual, combined with demographic realities. He said, unlike Obama's pledge, a smiling China knows that no state intervention will be needed if it indeed achieves that goal. In a region where the cunning of America and Chile and China is obsessively compared, it's been a good week for Beijing. Now, the reality is China is currently increasing emissions every year by the equivalent of Australia's total emissions. And President Xi's statement means that this will continue to be the case. And the world media fell over endorsing the so-called deal between Obama and Beijing. But President Xi has said that by 2030, fossil fuels will still represent 80% of China's energy usage. Renewables such as wind and solar will produce 3%. And while President Obama's proposal would weaken the US economy, everyone knew he couldn't deliver any legislative backing for what he was saying. Then, of course, Prime Minister Modi got in on the act from India in relation to coal. And one of his modest promises was to give 24/7 access to electricity for all of India's village communities. He's not going to do that with wind turbines, I can tell you. He acknowledged that India's power industry would have to double its capacity by 2025 to meet growth expectations. He wants another 300 million customers to enjoy new energy. In other words, China and India. China, for example, are building a new coal-fired power station every 10 days, every year. Coal is the poverty buster. Access to electricity, most of it generated by coal, is a right taken for granted by all our ideological left who want to decarbonise the economy. Even a report by our own government forecaster, the Bureau of Resource and Energy Economics, indicated that coal would fuel Prime Minister Modi's Indian ambitions. The Bureau of Resource and Energy Economics, ours, said, quote, coal-fired generation is a major component of India's plans for new electricity generating capacity being developed under the 12th five-year plan. So if coal's part of China's cheap energy and India's cheap energy needs, what the hell are we doing demonising it and pretending we have to put wind turbines up everywhere, subsidised by the taxpayer, which will never be able to meet our energy needs? Which leads us to a very important question addressed by Senator Bob Day, the South Australian senator, and that is, when are we going to stop arguing that carbon dioxide is a pollutant? When are we going to stop arguing and teaching our kids that carbon dioxide, man-made, is so-called warming the planet? And Senator Bob Day asks, when are these hoaxes going to be exposed? Now, Tony Abbott's the only one who's come close, but even he seems to be having sixpence each way. He's frightened of the left. As Senator Bob Day, Senator for South Australia, recently wrote, this year the world will enjoy its greatest grain crop on record. Let me say that again, said Bob Day. This year the world will enjoy its greatest grain crop on record. After the world food security crisis of 2007, this is Senator Bob Day, which saw civil unrest in some countries, it's fantastic to see that in just 7 years we are producing record amounts of food for a growing world population. He wrote, the US Department of Agriculture recently raised global crop predictions for corn, soy and wheat. But he says, yet the World Bank indicates that over the last 10 reporting years, the percentage of agricultural land worldwide has not changed. So what is driving this world food production boom? He answers his own question. Carbon dioxide. Plants are thriving on the extra CO2 in the atmosphere. Thank God there's someone in the National Parliament with a bit of common sense. Senator Bob Day is on the line. Good morning, Senator.
Yes, good morning.
Lo and behold, we've discovered that plants are soaking up the extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and growing more vigorously, eh?
Look, I think it was Clive James who said that there comes a crucial stage in big debates where the facts are there, but people don't yet want them. And I think we're now at that stage in this climate change debate. The facts are there, and people just need to know that this spending of billions and billions of dollars trying to lower carbon dioxide emissions by putting up the price of electricity, like you say, with wind towers and so on, is expensive, it's inefficient, and it's counterproductive.
And as you said, plants and trees and crops will absorb 130 billion tonnes more carbon dioxide this century than expected, so that carbon dioxide now has become the fertiliser.
Exactly. It's not just a benefit for food crops. It's a benefit to native vegetation, ancient forests, desert scrubs that the environment activists have been trying to preserve, and here it is happening.
And you've said, and asked the question, therefore, why is the Abbott government spending billions of dollars to reduce this airborne saviour of vegetation and food crops?
Look, I am, and I'm stunned at the number of intelligent people who are misleading the public. They know these facts, but they just feel that it's something that they have to go along with when the facts are on the table. Look, I have a science background. I'm no climate scientist, but chemistry was my best subject at school. I spent 6 years in a research laboratory, and any high school student will tell you that carbon dioxide is not a pollutant, that CO2 in the atmosphere is not pollution, and that the optimum growing conditions for plants and crops and market gardens and vegetables and so on is about 1,400 parts per million. The atmosphere at the moment is about 400, but the best is about 1,400, which is why they pump CO2 into glasshouses.
Absolutely, but you've said a whole political industry has developed around new arcane language to describe what we've known for centuries about producing food and improving our environment. You said a whole false economy has developed, fuelled by taxpayer funding, and then you list some of them through an emissions reduction fund, an emissions trading scheme, renewable energy targets, the Renewable Energy Agency, the Climate Change Authority, the Climate Change Departments and more, and here's the government boasting about deregulation. Well, get rid of some of them.
Exactly. And well, look, all I can do, Alan, is just keep telling the truth and putting out the facts. And they're the facts, that things like renewable energy targets and all these things, they make no difference to the climate, but they make a lot of people very rich.
That's right. And you called them, and good on you in your language, and you talked about the rent-seeking, carpet-bagging, bootlegging, crony capitalists jumping on the climate change bandwagon to suck money from the taxpayer. And that's what it is.
Including
the people in universities and bureaus of science and whatever who are getting funding from the government to say what the government wants to hear.
Yeah, the finance minister recently called Bill Shorten an economic girly man. He said because said he didn't have what it takes to fix the budget. Well, I've called the government a bunch of scientific girly men because they don't have what it takes to tell the truth about what's really going on with CO2 and with all these other rent.
And you're quite right. And you make this point. Your language, we are taking money from low-income families and spending it on dodgy activities with a spurious scientific basis, punishing the poor, rewarding the rent seekers, and churning money in taxes and grants and rebates. I mean, it's astonishing, isn't it, that we're still doing this?
Exactly.
And we're supposed to have a budget emergency.
Exactly.
Sorry?
Spot on that, and that's why I just keep putting it out
I know,
there.
you wrote, I'll tell you what Senator Day wrote. While many families struggle with the cost of living, while mums and dads struggle to find jobs to make ends meet, the government spends their money appeasing high-income elites enthralled by this latest cause and championed by celebrities, self-promoting experts, and certain elements of the media.
Exactly.
How much longer is this going to go on?
Well, like I said, there comes a stage in big debates where the facts are there and it's just a matter of time. The game is up, but it's just a matter of time because there are so many people living very nicely off the system. And who was it once said, those who stand to lose from a change fight a lot harder than those who stand to gain. But I'll just keep standing up in the Parliament and keep saying these things until they get the message.
You've said we're now committing $2.5 billion of taxpayers' money to be spent on reducing carbon dioxide to stop so-called global warming, while Arctic and Antarctic sea ice is growing. Your words, growing, not shrinking. You say it's bizarre. I am dismayed that honest, intelligent people can sit mute and watch this blatant trashing of both science and economics. But I'll bet Bob Day, Senator Bob Day, people from the government pass you in the corridors and in the Labor Party and say, keep at it, Bob. Look, I know what you're saying's right, but I can't say it.
That's exactly what they do. And especially like the news this morning out of the US, there's another massive cold snap. We're supposed to be global warming. Another massive cold snap, record snow drifts. What can I say?
Yeah. And even, well, what can you say? I mean, today we learned that the growth in China's carbon emissions over the next 15 years, they're not worried about any of this stuff. Their growth in carbon emissions, and China's building a new coal-fired power station every 10 days every year. I mean, their growth will swamp any emissions reduction by both the United States and Australia. China were laughing at us last week when Obama's promoting this new scheme and the left got on side and the ABC got on side. China were laughing, weren't they?
Well, they know that there's no way that Obama will be able to get his grandiose plan through his Congress. They just had a massive midterm election with a swing to the Republicans. They know he's never going to get this through, and that's why
absolutely.
The agreement is that they will keep increasing their emissions for the next 16 years.
Yeah, like that talking economic growth. You said, and we'll end here, Matthias Cormann told the Senate last week, and you said you quoted him, coal is good, coal is good. It's at the heart of our economic prosperity here in Australia and around the world. It's helped lift living standards for people right across the world. It'll continue to help lift living standards around the world. And you say, well, if that's so, if intelligent and like-minded people believe in all good conscience that the Coalition's emission reduction fund is wrong, then I urge them to speak up too. Don't be scientific girly men.
Yes,
hey?
It's me. Yes.
Good on you.
Thanks very much.
Great to talk to you.
Anytime.
Anytime indeed. There he is, Senator Bob Day. Why have we swallowed all of this? So that was the big APEC thing, and of course hook, line and sinker. We got it for days and days, did we not? Obama and the deal with China. They're just laughing at us, China. They're continuing to go on, and they'll continue to build a coal-fired power station every 10 days every year to wrench Chinese people out of poverty as a result of cheap energy. What do? We export the stuff so that they can have it cheap,